I thought the worst thing about buying a used car would be the monthly payments. I never imagined that a mysterious rattle under the hood would lead me to discover something that would save my neighbor's life and change everything I thought I knew about the quiet veteran who lived next door. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Most people ignore strange car noises, hoping they'll just go away. I'm not most people. When something doesn't make sense, I have to figure it out. That obsession with solving mysteries is exactly what my ex-boyfriend used to complain about. He'd roll his eyes when I'd spend hours researching why the refrigerator made that weird humming sound or why the bathroom light flickered every Tuesday morning. He called it annoying. I called it being thorough. But this time, my need to solve everything wasn't just about satisfying my curiosity. This time, it literally meant the difference between life and death for someone I barely knew but was about to care about more than I ever expected. Picture this, a small duplex in suburban Dayton, Ohio, where the houses are close enough that you can hear your neighbor's morning coffee routine, but far enough apart that you can pretend you don't notice when they haven't picked up their mail in 3 days. That's where this story begins, with me standing in my driveway at 7 in the morning, staring at my new 2018 Honda Civic that I'd been so proud of just 3 weeks earlier. I'm Nessa Hartwell, 28 years old, and until recently, I thought I had my life figured out. I work in marketing for a mid-sized company that makes office furniture, which sounds boring but pays the bills and gives me decent health insurance. I live alone in half of a duplex that I rent from Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who lives in Florida but owns 3 properties in Ohio. I'm practical, maybe to a fault. I research everything before I buy it, from the best price on laundry detergent to reading 17 different reviews before choosing a new phone case. The Honda represented something important to me. After my relationship with Derek ended 6 months ago, I'd been taking the bus to work and borrowing cars from friends for everything else. Buying this car was my declaration of independence, my proof that I could handle adult life on my own terms. I'd saved for 8 months, researched models for weeks, and negotiated the price down by $300. I felt like I'd conquered the world. Then there's Garrett Mills, my neighbor who lives in the other half of the duplex. Garrett is 52, keeps his gray hair military short, and has the kind of posture that tells you he spent years standing at attention. He's always polite when we cross paths, but our conversations never go beyond "Morning, Nessa" and discussions about whose turn it is to mow the shared front lawn. I've lived next to Garrett for 6 months, and here's everything I know about him. He drinks coffee on his front porch every morning at exactly 6 a.m., rain or shine. He grows tomatoes, peppers, and herbs in the small garden behind the house. He drives a 2003 Ford pickup truck that's seen better days but runs like clockwork. He gets his mail at the same time every afternoon and always sorts through it standing right there by the mailbox. And sometimes late at night I can hear him watching old war movies through our shared wall. We're neighbors in the truest sense, the kind who wave hello and help each other with packages but don't really know each other's stories. I've always sensed there was more to Garrett than his quiet routine suggested, but he had this way of politely deflecting any attempt at deeper conversation. When I'd ask about his garden, he'd give short, helpful answers about soil and watering schedules. When I mentioned I was looking for a reliable mechanic, he recommended 2 places in town and then changed the subject. I respected his privacy, but I'll admit I was curious about the man who lived such a structured, solitary life. Little did I know that my annoying car problem was about to pull back the curtain on a story of friendship, sacrifice, and the kind of loyalty that survives even death. The morning I brought the Honda home, I felt like I was finally becoming the adult I'd always pictured myself being. You know that feeling when you accomplish something you've been working toward for months and suddenly the future looks brighter? That was me, standing in the driveway with my keys in hand, admiring the clean lines and the way the morning sun reflected off the hood that didn't have a single dent. My previous car, a 2009 Nissan Altima that I'd inherited from my grandmother, had left me stranded exactly 3 times in the 6 months since Derek and I broke up. The first time was outside the grocery store on a Wednesday evening when the battery died and I had a trunk full of ice cream that melted while I waited for roadside assistance. The second time was in the parking lot at work, which was humiliating, because my boss had to give me a ride home and spent the entire drive asking if I was handling everything okay, in that tone people use when they think your life is falling apart. The third time was the final straw. I was on my way to my sister's house for her birthday dinner when the transmission started making sounds like a dying animal. I had to call an Uber, showed up an hour late with a story about car trouble, and spent the entire evening feeling like the family member who can't get her act together. That night, I decided enough was enough. I'd been saving money in a coffee can on top of my refrigerator, the old-fashioned way my grandmother taught me. Every week, whatever cash I had left after expenses went into that can. After 8 months, I had enough for a decent down payment on something reliable. I researched Honda Civics for 3 weeks, reading Consumer Reports reviews, watching YouTube videos about what to look for when buying used cars, and even calling my Uncle Ray in Detroit, who's worked at a Ford plant for 20 years. The car I found at Morrison's Used Cars seemed perfect. A 2018 Civic with 47,000 miles, one previous owner, clean interior, and a price that was exactly at the top of my budget but still reasonable. The salesman, a friendly guy named Pete who reminded me of my high school guidance counselor, let me test drive it twice and even encouraged me to take it to my own mechanic for an inspection before signing anything. "Smart girl," he said when I told him about the inspection plan. That's exactly what I'd tell my own daughter to do. The inspection came back clean. The mechanic, an older man named Frank, who'd been recommended by 3 different people, said it was one of the cleaner used cars he'd seen in months. Everything checked out perfectly. A week later, I signed the paperwork, made the down payment with my coffee can money plus a small loan from my credit union, and drove home feeling like I'd conquered the world. My duplex sits on Maple Street, a quiet residential area where most of the houses were built in the 1960s and have been lovingly maintained by owners who actually care about their neighborhood. The street is lined with mature oak trees that create a canopy in summer and drop gorgeous red and gold leaves in fall. It's the kind of place where people still wave to each other from their front porches and where you can walk to the corner store for milk without worrying about your safety. That first morning with the Honda in my driveway, I felt like I finally belonged in this adult neighborhood. I was washing the car when Garrett appeared in his small backyard garden, carrying a watering can and moving with the precise, economical movements I'd noticed in the 6 months I'd been living next door. "Morning, Garrett," I called out, unable to hide my pride as I gestured toward the Honda. He looked up from his tomato plants, his weathered face breaking into what might have been the first smile I'd ever seen from him. "Nice ride, Nessa. Hondas are reliable. Should serve you well." It was definitely the longest conversation we'd ever had, and something about the way he said "serve you well" struck me as oddly formal, almost military in its precision. But I was too excited about my new independence to think much about it then. "Thanks. I'm hoping this one actually gets me where I need to go without any drama." Garrett nodded, returned to his watering, and I went back to admiring my car. If someone had told me that morning that this Honda was about to become the center of a mystery that would change both our lives, I would have laughed. As far as I was concerned, the most exciting thing about this car was that it had Bluetooth connectivity and got good gas mileage. Everything was perfect for exactly 3 weeks and 2 days. I remember the exact timeline because I'd been keeping track of my gas mileage in a little notebook, proud of how efficiently the Honda was running. 28 miles per gallon in city driving, 34 on the highway. The car was everything I'd hoped for. Then, on a Tuesday morning, while I was sitting in the drive-through line at the coffee shop near my office, I heard it. A soft, metallic rattling sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere under the hood. It wasn't loud enough that other people would notice, but it was definitely there, like someone had dropped a handful of coins into a tin can and was gently shaking it. At first I told myself I was imagining things. New car anxiety, maybe. Or just being hypersensitive because my last car had trained me to listen for trouble. But over the next few days, the sound became impossible to ignore. It only happened when the car was idling, which meant I heard it. Every morning when I started the car, at every traffic light, and every time I pulled into a parking space. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard from a car before. It wasn't the grinding of brake pads or the squealing of a loose belt or the knocking of an engine that needed oil. This was distinctly metallic, rhythmic, and seemed to come from somewhere deep within the engine compartment. When I pressed the gas pedal, it would disappear completely. When I came to a stop, there it was again. By the end of the first week, I was parking 2 blocks away from my apartment and walking home, just so Garrett wouldn't hear the rattle and think I'd bought a piece of junk. I was embarrassed and increasingly worried that I'd made a terrible mistake despite all my careful research. I took the car back to Frank, the mechanic who'd done the pre-purchase inspection. He listened to the engine, looked under the hood, ran a computer diagnostic, and charged me $120 to tell me that everything appeared to be functioning normally. Sometimes cars just have personality quirks, Frank said, wiping his hands on a shop rag that had seen better days. As long as it's running smooth and the computer isn't throwing any codes, I wouldn't worry about it. But I did worry about it. The rattle was getting slightly louder each week, and I started to notice it was more pronounced when I parked on an incline. I made an appointment with Tony's Auto Service across town, a shop that specialized in Hondas and had excellent online reviews. Tony was more thorough than Frank had been. He put the car up on a lift, checked every accessible component, and even took it for a test drive around the block. When he brought it back to the bay, he had the same puzzled expression. Frank had warned, "I've been working on cars for 25 years, and I've never heard anything quite like this," Tony said, running his hand through his graying hair. "The engine's running perfectly. All the belts, hoses, fluid levels, everything checks out. Whatever's making that noise, it's not affecting performance or safety." "But what could it be?" I asked, hearing the desperation creeping into my voice. "Honestly, I have no idea. Could be something as simple as a heat shield that's come loose, or maybe something rattling in the air conditioning system. Without being able to pinpoint the exact location, I'd be guessing, and I don't like to charge people for guesswork." That night I lay in bed listening to my neighbor's television through our shared wall and feeling like a complete failure. I'd researched everything, had the car inspected, made what I thought was a smart, adult decision, and somehow I'd still ended up with a problem that 2 experienced mechanics couldn't solve. The rattle was starting to invade my thoughts during the day. I'd be sitting in meetings at work, and instead of focusing on quarterly marketing reports, I'd be wondering if other people could hear it when I pulled into the parking lot. I started leaving for work 10 minutes early so I could park in the far corner where fewer people would notice. Worst of all, the sound was robbing me of the joy and confidence I'd felt about this purchase. Every time I started the car, instead of feeling proud of my independence, I felt anxious and embarrassed. This Honda was supposed to be proof that I could make good decisions and take care of myself. Instead, it was becoming a daily reminder that maybe I wasn't as capable as I'd thought. After 2 weeks of sleepless nights and growing anxiety every time I turned the key, I reached my breaking point. It was a Thursday evening, and I was sitting in my living room pretending to watch Netflix while actually listening to my car tick and settle in the driveway outside. The rattle had become louder that week, and now I could swear I heard it even when the engine was off, like whatever was loose in there was still moving around from the vibrations. I called my brother Devin that night, partly because I needed advice and partly because I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. "Look, Nessa," Devin said in that patient voice he uses when he thinks I'm overthinking something. "You've had 2 mechanics look at it. Both said it's safe to drive. Maybe it's just something you'll have to live with. Some cars have quirks." "No, Devin, this isn't a quirk. Something is definitely wrong. I can feel it." "Feel it how?" "I can't explain it. It's like when you know someone's watching you even though you can't see them. There's something in that engine compartment that doesn't belong there." Devin was quiet for a moment. He knows me well enough to recognize when I've made up my mind about something. And he also knows that my instincts about mechanical problems are usually right. When I was 16, I correctly diagnosed a failing water pump in his first car 2 weeks before it actually died, just based on a subtle change in the engine sound. "What are you thinking of doing?" he asked. "I'm going to figure out what's causing that rattle myself." "Nessa, you're not a mechanic." "I don't need to be a mechanic to investigate a noise. I have eyes, I have hands, and I have the internet. People fix cars in their driveways all the time. The next morning was Saturday, which meant I had the entire day to dedicate to solving this mystery. I started by watching YouTube videos about Honda Civic maintenance, focusing on anything that could cause rattling sounds. I learned about heat shields, exhaust components, engine mounts, and air intake systems. I took notes in the same notebook where I'd been tracking my gas mileage, drawing diagrams, and making lists of things to check. Then I called my dad, who's not exactly mechanically gifted but owns a decent set of basic tools from his various home improvement projects over the years. "What do you need tools for?" Dad asked when I explained my plan. "I'm going to systematically check every accessible part of the engine until I find what's making that noise." "Honey, maybe you should just take it to another mechanic." "Dad, I've already spent over $200 for 2 different mechanics." To tell me they don't know what's wrong. I can't keep throwing money at a problem when the solution might be something simple that I can find myself. He agreed to bring his tools over, probably more out of curiosity than confidence in my plan. An hour later, he arrived with a toolbox that contained everything from screwdrivers to socket wrenches, most of which still looked relatively new because Dad tends to call professionals for anything more complicated than hanging pictures. "You sure about this?" he asked as we stood looking at the Honda's engine compartment. "Dad, the worst thing that can happen is I don't find anything and I'm exactly where I started. But if I do find something, I'll finally have answers." I started with the obvious suspects. I checked the oil dipstick, examined the air filter housing, looked for loose bolts or disconnected hoses. Everything appeared normal, but the systematic process was somehow calming. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking control of the situation instead of being a victim of it. The rattle was most noticeable when the car was idling, so I had Dad start the engine while I listened carefully to different areas under the hood. The sound definitely seemed to be coming from somewhere behind the engine, closer to where the engine meets the firewall that separates the engine compartment from the passenger cabin. That's when I noticed something odd about the cabin air filter housing. It's a rectangular plastic component that sits near the base of the windshield, and something about it looked different from the rest of the engine bay. While everything else had a thin layer of road dust and the kind of grime you'd expect on a car with 47,000 miles, the area around the cabin air filter housing looked like it had been handled recently. There were fingerprints in the dust around. The edges and one of the clips that holds it in place seemed slightly loose. My hands were shaking as I worked to remove the cabin air filter housing. Dad held a flashlight while I carefully unclipped the plastic fasteners, trying not to break anything in my excitement to solve this puzzle that had been consuming my thoughts for weeks. "You sure this is where the sound is coming from?" Dad asked, squinting into the engine compartment. "The fingerprints don't lie. Someone has been in here recently, and it wasn't a mechanic. Look at how clean this area is compared to everything else." When the housing came free, I immediately saw that the cabin air filter itself looked new, which was strange because Frank had mentioned during the pre-purchase inspection that it would probably need replacing soon. But what made my heart stop was what I saw behind where the filter had been sitting, wedged tightly against the back wall of the housing, wrapped in layers of silver duct tape, was a small plastic container about the size of a sandwich bag. It had been carefully positioned so it wouldn't interfere with airflow, but would definitely rattle against the plastic housing every time the engine vibrated. "What in the world?" Dad muttered, leaning closer. With trembling fingers, I worked the container free. It was heavier than I expected, and I could feel multiple objects moving around inside the tape wrapping. We carried it over to Dad's truck where we had better light, and I carefully peeled away layer after layer of duct tape. The first thing I saw when the tape came off was cash. More cash than I'd ever held in my hands at one time. $20 bills rolled up in rubber bands, 50s folded neatly, even some hundreds. My first instinct was panic because finding this much money felt like discovering evidence of something illegal. "Nessa, maybe we should call the police," Dad said, his voice tight with concern. But then I saw what was underneath the money, and everything changed. There was a folded piece of paper with an address written in careful block letters, and I recognized that address immediately. It was the Veterans Affairs Hospital across town, the same place I drove past every morning on my way to work. Beneath, that was a prescription bottle, and when I turned it over, I felt like the ground had shifted under my feet. The label was partially torn, but I could clearly read Garrett Mills and make out enough of the medication name to recognize it was something serious. Heart medication. The last filled date was over 2 months ago. "Oh my God," I whispered, sinking onto Dad's tailgate. "Dad, this belongs to Garrett." "Your neighbor Garrett?" I nodded, still staring at the prescription bottle. But how did it get in my car? And why would someone hide money with his medication? The final item in the container was a small photograph, creased and worn from being handled many times. It showed 3 men in army uniforms, standing in what looked like a desert landscape. I recognized Garrett immediately, but he looked younger, maybe in his 30s, with the same serious expression but fewer lines around his eyes. One of the other soldiers had his arm around Garrett's shoulders, a broad smile on his face despite the harsh surroundings. On the back of the photo, someone had written, "Marco, Garrett, and Davis, Afghanistan 2010, in the same block handwriting as the address. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what this meant. Someone named Marco had hidden this money with Garrett's medication information. But why in my car? And then a terrible thought hit me. Dad, what if Garrett doesn't know this is here? What if someone was supposed to tell him about it, but something happened? I looked toward our duplex, thinking about how pale Garrett had looked lately, how I hadn't seen him in his garden as much over the past few weeks. I'd assumed he was just busy or maybe dealing with the changing weather, but what if it was something more serious? What if he's been going without his heart medication because he can't afford to refill it and this money was supposed to help him? The pieces were falling into place in a way that made my stomach clench with urgency. This wasn't just about solving the mystery of a car rattle anymore. This was about someone's life. Someone who lived 20 feet away from me and was too proud or too isolated to ask for help. We need to talk to Garrett right now, I said, carefully rewrapping the container. I think my neighbor might be in serious trouble. I knocked on Garrett's door with the container clutched in my hands, my heart pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it through the wood. When he answered, I immediately knew something was very wrong. His usually neat gray hair was disheveled. His face was pale with a grayish tint I'd never noticed before, and he was gripping the doorframe like he needed it for support. "Nessa," he said, his voice weaker than I'd ever heard it. "Is everything all right?" "Garrett, I found something in my car that I think belongs to you." I held up the container, watching his expression change from confusion to recognition to something that looked like relief mixed with despair. His knees buckled slightly, and I reached out to steady him. "Can I come in? I think we need to talk." Inside his small living room, which was exactly as neat and organized as I'd expected, Garrett sank into an armchair that had clearly seen decades of use. I sat across from him and gently placed the container on his coffee table between us. "Where did you find this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hidden behind the cabin air filter in my Honda." It was making a rattling sound that's been driving me crazy for weeks. Garrett's eyes filled with tears, something I never would have imagined seeing from this stoic man who barely spoke beyond polite greetings. "Marco," he said simply, and I knew he was talking about one of the soldiers in the photograph. "He was your friend." "My best friend. We served 3 tours together in Afghanistan. When I got out, I had trouble adjusting. Marco helped me find this place, helped me get into the VA system, helped me figure out how to be a civilian again." Garrett wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. "About 6 months ago, my heart started acting up. The VA doctors prescribed medication, but even with my benefits, the co-pays were more than I could manage on my disability check." I felt my throat tighten as the pieces fell into place. "Marco was helping you?" "He wanted to, but I'm too proud for my own good. I kept refusing his money, telling him I'd figure it out, so he got creative." Garrett managed a weak smile. "He bought your car from the dealer, knowing I'd been looking at it online. He planned to park it in the driveway and, accidentally, let me discover the money while I was helping him check the engine. But something happened to Marco. Heart attack 2 weeks after he bought the car. His family had no idea about our arrangement. They just saw a car they needed to sell quickly, to settle his affairs. The full weight of the situation hit me. Marco had died before he could execute his plan to help his friend, and Garrett had been suffering in silence ever since, too proud to ask for help and unaware that help had already been arranged. How long have you been going without your medication? About 6 weeks. I kept thinking I could stretch what I had, maybe find a way to afford the refill next month. I didn't hesitate. We're going to the hospital right now. Nessa, I can't afford... Garrett, there's over $3,000 in this container. That's going to cover your medication, and then some. The emergency room doctor confirmed what I'd suspected. Garrett was in the early stages of heart failure, a direct result of missing doses of his prescribed medication. If we'd waited another week, he might not have survived. 6 months later, Garrett and I have become the kind of neighbors I never knew I wanted. He taught me how to grow tomatoes in the small garden plot behind our duplex, sharing stories about Marco and their friendship that survived combat, distance, and even death. I help him navigate VA paperwork and drive him to medical appointments when his truck acts up. The Honda still has a very faint rattle occasionally, especially on cold mornings, but now we both smile when we hear it. It's become our reminder of the day that changed everything, the day a mysterious car problem led us to discover that sometimes the most annoying things in our lives are actually pointing us toward exactly where we need to be. Marco never got to see his plan work, but his final act of friendship didn't just save Garrett's life. It taught me that true independence isn't about handling everything alone. Sometimes being truly independent means recognizing when someone needs help and having the courage to offer it, even when they're too proud to ask.